An introductory story. The wind that swept down from the Cotentin Peninsula in the autumn of 1035 was a cold, biting thing, carrying the salt tang of the English Channel and the whisper of impending doom. In the great hall of Falaise, the air was thicker still, choked with wood smoke and a fear so palpable a child could taste it. And he was just a child. 7 summers old. William stood on legs that felt like green willow, the rough-spun wool of his tunic scratching his neck. The stone walls, usually alive with the boisterous clamor of his father's knights, were now a tomb of hushed voices and sidelong glances. They called him Guillaume le Bâtard, not to his face, not yet, but he heard it. It was woven into the very fabric of his life, a constant, shadowed companion to his title, the Duke of Normandy. His father was gone. Robert the Magnificent, the man of roaring laughter and a grip that could shatter a walnut, was dead on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The news had arrived not with a herald's cry, but like a thief in the night, stealing the stability from William's world. A hand, heavy and calloused, rested on his small shoulder. It was the Archdeacon of Rouen, one of the few men whose eyes did not hold the gleam of opportunism. "Courage, my lord," the old man murmured, his voice a low rasp. "The barons are coming. You must be strong." William nodded, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He looked past the archdeacon to the high table, where his father's empty chair sat like a granite throne. He remembered sitting on his father's knee, the scent of leather and wine about him. "Normandy is your birthright, my boy," Robert had said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "They will test you. They will see a boy, a bastard, and they will come for your lands, your title, your very life. You must be harder than the steel of their swords." The great oak doors groaned open, and the barons filed in. They were not the loyal vassals of song and story. These were wolves, their mail coats glinting like scales, their faces carved from the same grim stone as the Norman cliffs. Gilbert of Brienne, his own kinsman, stood as his guardian, but William saw the calculation in his eyes. The boy duke was a pawn, a key to be turned for a share of the treasury, a strip of land, a moment of power. One baron, a hulking man from the Bessin with a scar bisecting his brow, let his gaze linger on William. It was not a look of fealty, but of appraisal, like a butcher sizing up a spring lamb. In that moment, the abstract fear crystallized into a cold, hard knot in William's stomach. He was alone. His mother, Herleva, the woman with the dancer's grace who had captured a duke's heart from the tannery vats, could not protect him here. The Pope in Rome would not send armies for a bastard. But as the weight of their ambition pressed down upon him, something kindled in the boy's heart, not the warm flame of courage, but the cold, blue fire of defiance. He straightened his back, lifting his chin to meet the scarred baron's stare. The hall fell silent, the only sound the spit and crackle of the great fire. He would not break. He would not be erased. The title they mocked, the blood they scorned, would become his armor and his banner. This child, this bastard, would learn to speak the only language these wolves understood, the language of iron and fire. The path from this hall of shadows would be paved with betrayal and slick with blood, leading across a wind-lashed sea to a crown that waited, glinting, on a distant shore called England. The boy was gone. The conqueror was being born. The wind that had carried Duke Robert the Magnificent from the shores of Normandy, a wind filled with the pious zeal of a pilgrimage to the holy city of Jerusalem, now returned as a hollow echo, a whisper of ash and loss. It found its way through the drafty corridors of the ducal castle at Falaise, a place that had, until so very recently, been a universe of security for the boy William. At 7 years old, the world was a structure built by his father, as solid and imposing as the granite walls of the keep. Robert was not just a father, he was a force of nature, a man whose laughter could fill a hall and whose anger could make seasoned knights flinch. He was the axis around which William's life spun, the source of all authority, all protection, and all identity. To be the son of such a man, even if that son bore the whispered, venomous title of the bastard, was to occupy a place of recognized, if occasionally contested, honor. That identity, that entire world, shattered in the autumn of 1035 with the arrival of a dust-stained, weary messenger whose downcast eyes and faltering voice delivered the unthinkable news: Duke Robert was dead. He had not fallen in glorious battle, a death a young boy in a martial society could perhaps comprehend and mythologize, but had succumbed to a fever in the distant, alien city of Nicaea, on the long road back from Jerusalem. His body lay in a foreign land, and with his passing, the stability of Normandy was buried alongside him. The immediate aftermath was not a period of orderly mourning but a vacuum, and nature, especially the political nature of 11th century Normandy, abhors a vacuum. The great hall, once resonant with Robert's booming commands and the clatter of feasting, became a theater of shadows and murmurs. The air grew thick with the scent of tallow smoke and unspoken ambitions. William, dressed in clothes that suddenly felt too large for his small frame, was now the focal point of every conversation, yet he was utterly powerless within them. He was the Duke, yes, but he was a child, and worse, a child born of Herleva, the woman his father had loved but never married. The title, bastard, was no longer a mere whisper behind cupped hands, it became a political reality, a crack in the very foundation of his claim through which the wolves began to slink. These wolves were his own kin, the proud, fractious, and land-hungry Norman barons who had bowed to Robert's iron will but saw in his son only a vulnerability to be exploited. They did not see a grieving child, they saw a key to a treasury, a signature on a charter, a pawn to be moved across the chessboard of power. His official guardians, like his cousin Gilbert of Brionne, were appointed to protect him, but their protection felt like a cage, their loyalty a thin veneer over a bottomless well of self-interest. William saw it in their eyes, the quick, calculating glances they exchanged over his head, the patronizing pats on the shoulder that felt less like comfort and more like a man testing the weight of a lamb for market. The anarchy did not creep in, it erupted. With the central authority of the Duke enfeebled and embodied in a child, the intricate web of oaths and loyalties that bound the duchy together began to unravel with terrifying speed. The province descended into what the chroniclers would later call the disorder of the Normans, a time of pure, unadulterated chaos. Castles that were meant to be the pillars of ducal power became the strongholds of rebellious viscounts and petty lords who declared themselves masters of their own domains. The roads, once patrolled by the Duke's men, became hunting grounds for bandits and rival knights settling old scores with fire and sword. The peasantry, as always, bore the brunt of this collapse, their fields burned, their meager stores plundered, their lives rendered cheaper than the dirt they tilled. For William, trapped within the relative safety of his castles, this was not an abstract political crisis, it was a personal reign of terror. The world outside his window had become a place of treachery and sudden death. He learned that trust was a luxury he could not afford, that a friendly face could mask a murderous intent. He was shuffled from one stronghold to another, not as a duke on a progress, but as a fugitive protecting his own life. The lessons of these years were not read from parchment but were seared into his soul with the heat of burning homesteads and the cold steel of assassins' knives. He learned that power, true power, was not inherited, it was taken, and it was held not by right of birth alone, but by the strength to enforce that right against all challengers. The violence was not a distant rumor, it lapped at his very heels, its most intimate and horrifying manifestation arriving one night with the sound of hurried footsteps and the glint of drawn steel within his own household. The specifics are lost to time, shrouded in the deliberate obscurity of chroniclers who may have wished to forget, but the brutal truth remains, men tasked with his safety, men who had broken bread with him, who had perhaps taught him how to hold a practice sword, turned on him. His chamberlain, Osborne, a man whose duty was the most personal form of protection, was murdered while standing guard at the very door to the young duke's bedchamber. William was almost certainly in the room, a terrified boy huddled in the dark, listening to the gurgled cries and the sickening thuds of a loyal man being butchered for the crime of protecting him. The assassins, likely in the pay of a rival lord who saw the boy's elimination as the cleanest solution to the problem of succession, were upon him. He was saved in the nick of time, pulled from his bed and hidden, perhaps under a floorboard, in a laundry chest, or smuggled through a secret passage by a quick-thinking servant or a guardsman whose loyalty had not yet been purchased. The physical survival was a miracle, but the psychological scar was permanent. That night, the abstract concepts of betrayal and mortal danger became a visceral, tangible memory, the smell of blood, the panicked whispers, the cold fear that clutched a child's heart. It was the ultimate lesson: there was no sanctuary, not even in his own bed. From that moment forward, the boy had to die so the survivor could live. The softness of childhood was a vulnerability he could no longer afford. He learned to school his features, to hide his fears and his affections alike, to look at every man around him and not see a companion or a guardian, but a potential threat to be assessed, managed, or eliminated. The iron that would later define his character was being tempered in the forge of these relentless, hidden horrors. This was the true inheritance of William the Bastard, not a peaceful duchy, but a crucible of fire and blood, a relentless education in the art of survival at any cost, a childhood sacrificed on the altar of a title he had to grow into or be destroyed by. The years that stretched from the terror-stricken boy in the drafty halls of Falaise to the young man who now sat astride a warhorse, his gaze scanning the formidable stone walls of Alassa, were a decade written not in ink but in scar tissue. The anarchy of his minority had been a brutal, unrelenting tutor, and William had been its most gifted pupil. He had learned to speak the guttural language of the sword and the sly whisper of political alliance with equal fluency. The frightened child who had been hidden from assassins was gone, replaced by a duke who had, piece by bloody piece, reclaimed his birthright from the wolves who had sought to dismember it. He had fought his own kinsmen, outmaneuvered treacherous guardians, and cemented pacts with the King of France, not as a supplicant, but as a formidable ally. His very body bore the map of this struggle, the hardened muscle of a warrior, the set of a jaw that had learned to clench against pain and betrayal. He was no longer merely the bastard by the accident of his birth. He had forged that epithet into a weapon, a persona of such unyielding resolve that men now followed him not just out of feudal obligation, but from a mixture of awe and fear. He had proven he could survive. Now, at Alassa in the year 1049, he would prove he would brook no insult, that the shadow of his past would no longer be a weakness his enemies could exploit. The fortress of Alassa, perched defiantly on the border of his domain, held by a rebellious lord, was more than a military objective. It was a symbol of the lingering contempt for his authority, a test of his newly forged power. The siege had been a grinding, muddy affair, the air thick with the smoke of burning outbuildings and the constant, damp chill of the Norman autumn. William's camp was a small, disciplined city of leather and steel, its rhythms dictated by the thud of catapults and the vigilant watches of his sentries. He moved among his men, his presence a quiet catalyst of order. They saw a leader who had earned his place not through a coronation alone, but through a dozen skirmishes and battles. Yet, within the walls of Alassa, the defenders clung to an older narrative, the one from his childhood that he had spent his adolescence trying to erase. As his siege engines lumbered into position and his knights tightened the noose around the town's defenses, the garrison, growing desperate and seeking to break his spirit with the one weapon they believed still had power, resorted to a gesture of profound psychological warfare. They did not simply shout curses or boast of their provisions, they mounted the ramparts, their figures stark against the grey sky, and they brandished not weapons, but animal hides. They beat these pelts against the stone merlons, waving them like grotesque flags, and their voices, sharp with mockery and frayed with defiance, carried clearly across the field. Hides! Hides for the tanner, they screamed, their laughter a weapon more piercing than any arrow. Come see the tanner's grandson. We have work for you. The words, laden with a contempt so personal and so deeply aimed at the most vulnerable part of his identity, struck the entire Norman camp with a physical force. A sudden, thick silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the campfires and the distant, jeering cries. Every man, from the lowest foot soldier to the highest-ranking baron, froze. Eyes, wide with a mixture of horror and a morbid curiosity, flickered furtively towards their duke. This was the ultimate challenge, one that went beyond the military. It was a public, spectacular humiliation designed to unmask him as the bastard son of Herleva, the daughter of a man who worked with animal skins, a trade considered vile and dishonorable by the warrior aristocracy. It was an attempt to strip him of the dignity of his office, to reduce the Duke of Normandy to a punchline, to remind everyone that for all his power, his bloodline was, in their eyes, still foul. They waited for the outburst, the flush of shame, the furious and perhaps reckless order to assault the walls immediately, the reaction of an emotional, shamed boy. But what they saw was something far more terrifying. William did not flinch. He did not roar. He went preternaturally still. The color did not rise in his face, instead, it seemed to drain away, leaving his features a cold, pale mask. His eyes, usually so alert and calculating, fixed on the distant figures on the wall with an intensity that was less like looking and more like etching. In that profound silence, which lasted only a handful of heartbeats but felt like an eternity, the last vestiges of any boyhood sensitivity were extinguished. The insult did not wound him, it was metabolized, transformed in the crucible of his will into a cold, pure fuel for vengeance. This was no longer about subduing a rebellion, it was about annihilating an idea. He turned slowly from the walls of Alasa, his movements deliberate, almost calm. His voice, when it finally came, was low, devoid of the rage they all expected, but carrying a timbre of such absolute, chilling finality that it promised a horror far beyond a simple battle cry. He gave orders, not for a general assault, but for a specific, gruesome task. A detachment of his swiftest, most brutal soldiers was assembled. Their mission was not to scale the walls, but to capture. The gates of the town, perhaps in a sally meant to capitalize on their taunts, were thrown open, and a group of defenders, emboldened by their own mockery, surged out. William's men, acting with the precision of a surgeon's knife, did not engage in a prolonged melee. They surrounded them, cut them down, and, as per their duke's explicit command, took them alive. The jeering from the walls turned to shouts of alarm as the scene unfolded below. What followed was not an execution, but a performance of terror. William had the captives stripped, their hands bound. He then commanded that the very instruments of his humiliation, the animal hides, be brought to him. And with a cold, ceremonial purpose that spoke of a symbolic mind of immense and frightening power, he ordered his men to use their knives and axes not to kill the prisoners, but to mutilate them. They cut off their hands and their feet, the instruments of their gesticulating mockery and the means of their defiance. The air, once filled with taunts, was now rent with screams of a very different, more primal kind. This act of calculated brutality was not the end of the lesson, it was only the beginning. The maimed, bleeding men were not left to die on the field. In a move that demonstrated a chilling understanding of psychological warfare that far surpassed the crude taunts of the defenders, William ordered that the prisoners be released. They were set free to stumble, crawl, and bleed their way back towards the gates of Alasa, a living, screaming testament to the price of insulting the Duke. This grisly procession, this parade of agony, was a message delivered not by a herald, but by the victims themselves. It was a message that said the past was no longer a weapon to be used against him, he had seized that weapon and would now turn it back upon his enemies with unimaginable force. The title, bastard, and the tanner's grandson, were now inextricably, horrifyingly linked not to shame, but to a retribution so absolute it would leave men permanently broken. The sight of their comrades, reduced to writhing, shrieking ruins, broke the spirit of the garrison in a way that 1,000 catapult stones never could. The mockery on the walls ceased, replaced by a stunned, terrified silence. The will to fight drained from the defenders as if their own veins had been opened. The price of resistance had been made gruesomely clear. When the gates of Alasa finally swung open in surrender, it was not to a conquering hero, but to an avenging force of nature. William entered the town not with the triumphant air of a victor, but with the grim finality of a judge who had carried out his own sentence. His men, their earlier unease transformed into a kind of fearful, absolute loyalty, followed him. They understood now that the man they served possessed a will of iron and a capacity for violence that was not hot and impulsive, but cold, deliberate, and limitless. The news of Alasa did not simply travel, it seeped like a stain across Normandy and beyond its borders. It became a story told in hushed tones in other castle halls where discontent might be brewing. The lesson was learned by friend and foe alike. To question William's legitimacy, to mock his origins, was to invite a horror far worse than death on the battlefield. From that day forward, the epithet, the bastard, was spoken not as a slur, but as a title of fearful respect, a name that evoked the image of a man who had taken the deepest wound of his soul and hardened it into the sharpest edge of his sword. The tapestry of William's life, woven with threads of iron and vengeance, now encountered a strand of such improbable fortune it seemed spun by the fates themselves. The years following the brutal lesson of Alassa had seen his power consolidate, his reputation as a duke not to be trifled with solidifying into an unshakable truth. He had navigated the treacherous currents of continental politics, balancing an uneasy alliance with the King of France against the ever-present threat of his own restive barons. He was a master of his duchy, but his gaze, as ambitious men's gazes often do, had begun to drift across the narrow sea, towards the rich, troubled kingdom of England. The child who had fought for his birthright in Normandy now harbored a king's ambition for a crown that was not, by any common law, his. The justification for such an audacious claim was a tangled web of distant kinship, half-promises, and the bald ambition that has ever been the true engine of history. He would later claim that his cousin, the childless Edward the Confessor, King of England, had years earlier, during a period of exile in Normandy, promised him the succession. It was a convenient, unverifiable story, a thin parchment on which to base an invasion. But in the year 1064, fortune, in the most dramatic fashion, delivered into his hands a document of flesh and blood, a hostage to destiny far more tangible than any whispered promise from a pious king. The English Channel, that tempestuous moat between two worlds, was a fickle and dangerous power. It could be a highway for trade and ambition, or a watery grave for the unwary. For Harold Godwin's son, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful man in England after King Edward himself, it became a trap. The precise reasons for his voyage remain shrouded in the mists of contradictory chronicles, a diplomatic mission on Edward's behalf, a simple fishing trip gone horribly wrong, or perhaps, as Norman sources would later insist, a deliberate journey to reaffirm Edward's promise to William. Whatever its purpose, the voyage ended in disaster. A storm, one of those sudden, violent squalls that terrorize the narrow sea, seized his ship, driving it from its course and smashing it onto the hostile coast of Ponthieu, a territory bordering William's domains. Shipwrecked and disoriented, Harold and his men found themselves not in a friendly port, but prisoners of Count Guy of Ponthieu, a petty lord who saw in these well-dressed, noble castaways a magnificent opportunity for ransom. The mighty Earl of Wessex, the man who held the very fabric of English politics in his hands, was thrown into a damp cell, his fate reduced to a bargaining chip between minor nobles. News, however, in a land as politically charged as Normandy, traveled faster than the wind that had caused the wreck. Word reached William in Rouen, not as a vague rumor, but as a confirmed report. Harold Godwin's son, his rival, his key to England, was languishing in a dungeon just a few days' ride away. The strategic implications were staggering, a gift from God so perfect it seemed almost divine. William did not hesitate. He moved with the swift, decisive authority of a man who recognizes the hinge of fate turning. He dispatched stern messengers to Count Guy, demanding the immediate release of the English noble into his custody. The message was less a request and more a command, backed by the unspoken threat of the army that had raised Alassa. Guy, understanding the shift in power, complied readily, perhaps even with relief, eager to curry favor with his formidable neighbor. Harold was extracted from his squalid prison and escorted, with every appearance of honor, into the heart of Normandy, to William's ducal court at Bonneville-sur-Taux. The stage was now set for one of the most consequential and controversial encounters of the Middle Ages. The man who arrived at Bonneville was a figure every bit as formidable as William himself. Harold Godwin's son was in his prime, tall, strong, and radiating the confident authority of a man born to power and accustomed to wielding it. He was a seasoned warrior, a cunning politician, and the scion of the most powerful family in England. He did not come as a supplicant, but as an equal, a fellow prince in distress, expecting the courtesy and aid due his station. William, the master of theatre, provided it. He received Harold not as a prisoner, but as a guest of the highest honor. There were feasts in the great hall, where torchlight gleamed on silver goblets and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. There were hunting trips in the lush Norman forests, displays of martial prowess in the tiltyard, and long, earnest conversations by the fire. William played the part of the magnanimous host to perfection, lavishing gifts upon his guest, regaling him with stories of his own struggles, and subtly, insistently, weaving a narrative of friendship and mutual obligation. He spoke of the old ties between Normandy and England, of his blood relation to King Edward, and of the king's alleged promise. He presented himself not as a potential invader, but as the rightful heir, a man whose claim was just and whose friendship could be Harold's greatest asset. For Harold, surrounded by Norman strength and deeply in William's debt for his rescue from Count Guy, the situation was a gilded cage. Every courtesy was also a pressure, every gift a chain. He was a pawn in a game whose rules were being written by his host, and he was running out of moves. Then came the pivotal moment, the scene upon which the fate of two nations would turn. William gathered his court, his most powerful barons and bishops, in the great hall. The atmosphere was charged, formal, a stark contrast to the earlier feasts. There, before this assembly of the most influential men in Normandy, William turned to Harold. He spoke again of his claim to the English throne, but this time, the conversation was not a suggestion, it was a culmination. He asked Harold, as a friend and as a man of honor, to swear an oath. The oath was multifaceted and devastatingly comprehensive. Harold was to swear to act as William's representative at Edward's court, to garrison the castle of Dover with Norman troops, and, most crucially, to uphold and support William's claim to the throne of England upon Edward's death. The air grew still. All eyes were on the Earl of Wessex. To refuse was unthinkable, it would be a gross insult to his host and rescuer, likely resulting in his immediate imprisonment or death, and the loss of any hope of returning to England. To agree was to betray his own king, his country, and his own towering ambition, for Harold himself was a contender for the crown. He was trapped. With no viable alternative, Harold assented. But William, a man who understood the power of symbolism and the eternal weight of sacred fear, ensured this would be no ordinary pledge. He had the servants bring forth a chest, and from it, they lifted not a Bible, but the most holy, the most terrifying objects in the medieval world, the relics of saints. These were the bones and personal effects of Normandy's most venerated holy figures, housed in beautifully crafted reliquaries that gleamed with gold and jewels. To a man of the 11th century, these were not mere objects, they were conduits to the divine, charged with a spiritual power so potent that an oath sworn upon them was made not just to man, but directly to God. To break such an oath was to damn one's soul for all eternity, to invite divine wrath not only upon oneself but upon one's entire family and kingdom. The reliquaries were placed upon a table, covered with a cloth of gold. William stood beside them, his face an unreadable mask of piety and expectation. Harold, his own face perhaps pale, his heart surely heavy, stepped forward. He placed his hands upon the cold, hard caskets that held the sacred remains. The entire court watched, breathless, as he spoke the words William demanded. He swore the oath. He pledged his honor, his loyalty, and his soul to the cause of making William the next king of England. For William, it was the moment of supreme triumph. He had transformed a shaky, self-serving claim into a sacred compact. He had not just a rival, he had a sworn vassal. The man most likely to oppose him in England had now publicly, and under the most binding conditions imaginable, pledged to support him. For Harold, the moment the words left his lips, a chill must have settled in his soul. He had secured his freedom, but at the cost of a terrible, perhaps impossible, burden. He was released soon after, returning to England with the taste of Norman wine and the weight of a holy oath sour in his mouth. He would carry the memory of those Norman relics, the grim face of the Duke, and the sound of his own voice making a promise he knew, in the deep recesses of his heart, he might one day have to break. William, watching Harold's ship disappear over the horizon, knew he had secured something more valuable than an army. He had secured a casus belli blessed by God himself. The bastard of Normandy now had a sacred justification for his kingly ambition. The oath sworn on the holy relics at Bonneville-sur-Touques was not a conclusion but a fuse, smoldering for 2 long years until the death of the saintly Edward the Confessor in January of 1066 snapped the final thread of peace. In England, with a speed that spoke of premeditated ambition, the Witan, the council of great nobles, offered the crown to Harold Godwin's son. He did not refuse. The sacred oath was shattered, and in that moment of Harold's coronation, William's meticulously crafted justification for invasion transformed from a political theory into a righteous crusade. The bastard duke was now the wronged prince, his honor and his divine right trampled by a perjurer. But righteous fury does not build ships, nor does it fill the bellies of mercenaries. The 2 years of waiting had been spent in a whirlwind of diplomatic and logistical preparation, a masterpiece of medieval statecraft. William had secured the blessing of Pope Alexander II, a moral victory that painted his enterprise not as a greedy land grab but as a holy war against an oathbreaker, a banner of sanctity under which knights from across Europe could rally without sin. His court became a magnet for adventurers from Brittany, Flanders, Aquitaine, and even Italy, men lured by the promise of English land and silver, their diverse tongues and battle styles coalescing into a formidable, if volatile, invasion force. The shores of the Dives estuary became a sprawling, chaotic forest of industry, the air perpetually thick with the sound of 1,000 axes felling trees and the rasp of adzes shaping hulls. William oversaw it all, a relentless presence, his will the single engine driving this colossal undertaking forward. He was no longer just a duke, he was the impresario of a vast and dangerous production, and the stage was the English Channel. For weeks, the assembled fleet was pinned by persistent northerly winds, winds that blew not only in the face of his ambition but directly into the hands of his rival. For while William paced the shores of Dives, a second threat to Harold's crown had emerged from the north. Harald Hardrada, the legendary Viking king of Norway, a giant of a man known as the last of the Vikings, had landed in Yorkshire with a massive fleet, backed by Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother, Tostig. The English king, forced to choose between 2 mortal enemies, marched his elite housecarls north with stunning speed. The winds that held William captive had, in a cruel twist, allowed Harold to confront the Norse threat without distraction. The news that reached Normandy was momentous. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwin's son had achieved a spectacular victory, annihilating the Norwegian army and killing both Hardrada and Tostig. But victory came at a catastrophic cost. Harold's own formidable army was bloodied and exhausted, its ranks thinned, and it was now hundreds of miles from the southern coast. And in that very moment, as if summoned by a demonic pact, the wind changed. The persistent northerlies that had been William's jailer swung abruptly to the south. It was the sign he had waited for, a breath of divine favor. The order was given, and a frenzy of activity engulfed the Norman camp. Through the night of September 27th, the estuary was a scene of controlled chaos, lit by flickering torches as thousands of men, horses, and tons of supplies were loaded onto the waiting ships. The crossing itself was a tense, moonlit affair, the dark water a churning inkwell dotted with the shadows of over 700 vessels, the air filled with the creak of timbers, the snap of sails, and the murmured prayers of men facing the wrath of the sea and the uncertainty of battle. At dawn on September 28, the lead ships ground their keels into the shingle beach of Pevensey Bay. There was no opposition. William, perhaps in a dramatic gesture, stumbled as he leaped from his ship onto the sand. A gasp rippled through his men, a terrible omen of a faltering start. But with the quick wit of a born leader, he rose to his feet, his hands full of English soil, and boomed, "See! I have taken England with both my hands." The omen was transformed into a prophecy of conquest. The army, its spirit lifted, poured onto the beach, a multi-hued tide of steel and chainmail. They secured the old Roman fort at Pevensey, then moved east along the coast to the more defensible peninsula of Hastings, where they began constructing a wooden castle, a statement of permanent intent. The bastard was on English soil. The invader had become an occupier. For 2 weeks, William fortified his position at Hastings, a predator waiting in his lair. He sent out scouts and raiding parties, a deliberate provocation, a burning of the local countryside meant to draw Harold out. It was a brutal but calculated strategy. He needed a decisive battle, a single, crushing blow. A protracted campaign would favor the defender, allowing Harold to gather the full might of England. Harold, flushed with his victory in the north but grieving the loss of his best troops, took the bait. Driven by a fury to defend his kingdom and perhaps a reckless confidence from his recent triumph, he made a fateful decision. Instead of waiting to gather a vast, fresh host from across England, he force-marched his battered housecarls and the FYRD of the southern shires back from York to London, and then, without adequate rest, straight down the Roman road to Hastings. He covered the 240 miles in a mere 9 days, a staggering feat of endurance that left his men exhausted before the battle even began. On the night of October 13th, the two armies, the two heralds, one the crowned king, the other the sworn duke, camped within sight of each other's fires in the dense woodlands around Senlac Hill. The air was cold, the ground damp, and the silence was a taut wire, humming with the tension of the morrow. Dawn on October 14, 1066, broke on a scene of terrible and majestic order. Harold had arrayed his army in a solid, towering shield wall along the crest of Senlac Hill, a living rampart of interlocked oak and iron. His housecarls, the professional warriors with their dreaded two-handed axes, formed the core, their ranks bolstered by the farmers and freemen of the FYRD, their spears bristling like a lethal thicket. They held the high ground, a formidable advantage, and their position was anchored on flanks by marshy, difficult terrain. They were defending their own soil, a powerful morale force. William's army, by contrast, was a complex machine of 3 divisions, the Bretons on the left, the Franco-Flemish mercenaries on the right, and his own Normans in the center. His tactics were more sophisticated, relying on a combined arms approach of archers, infantry, and heavy cavalry, the latter being a force the English army almost entirely lacked. The battle began with a roar. Norman archers loosed volleys of arrows, but shooting uphill, most thudded harmlessly into the English shields or sailed over their heads. William's infantry charged up the slope, a wave of steel crashing against the unbreakable cliff of the English shield wall. The sound was a deafening cacophony of splintering wood, shrieking metal, and the guttural cries of men killing and dying. The English line held, repelling charge after charge with grim determination. The Breton division on William's left, facing the fiercest resistance, began to falter and then broke, streaming back down the hill in disarray. A rumor, swift and deadly as an arrow, shot through the Norman ranks: the Duke is slain. Panic, the great undoer of armies, began to take hold. This was the moment. The hinge upon which history turned. Had Harold possessed a reserve of fresh cavalry to launch a counterattack, the battle, and the future of England, might have been lost for William. But William, in a display of raw, personal courage that defined his entire life, did the unthinkable. He galloped into the path of his fleeing men, his helmet shoved back so all could see his face, his voice cutting through the din of panic. "Look at me. I am alive, and by God's grace, I will conquer." It was a performance of sheer will. He seized the narrative of his own death and shattered it. Then, in a stroke of tactical genius, he turned the English pursuit to his advantage. Seeing that segments of the English FYRD, emboldened by the seeming rout, had broken ranks to chase the fleeing Bretons, he ordered a feigned retreat. It was a dangerous, sophisticated maneuver, requiring immense discipline. His cavalry turned and fled, luring more of the English off the high ground onto the flat plain below. Then, at his signal, they wheeled around, surrounding and butchering the isolated Englishmen. This game of deadly feint and counterfeint was repeated throughout the long, bloody afternoon, each time weakening the irreplaceable English shield wall. The battle degenerated into a brutal war of attrition. The Norman archers, now firing their arrows in a higher arc to fall like lethal rain upon the packed English ranks, began to find their mark. The relentless cavalry charges, combined with the devastating hail of arrows, slowly turned the tide. The chroniclers would later fixate on one moment, perhaps apocryphal but powerfully symbolic, the arrow that struck King Harold in the eye. Whether it was true or not, the heart of the English resistance was pierced. The king fell, and with him, the spirit of his army. The housecarls fought and died to the last man around the body of their lord, but the FYRD, its will broken, melted away into the darkening woods. As the October sun set on the bloody ridge of Senlac Hill, the field belonged to William. The air, once filled with war cries, was now a chorus of moans from the wounded and the dying. The bastard of Normandy had gambled his entire destiny on a single day, and he had won. The crown of England, which had seemed an impossible dream, now lay amidst the carnage, waiting for him to claim it. The victory at Hastings was not an end, but a brutal, bloody beginning. The road from the carnage of Senlac Hill to the throne of Edward the Confessor was paved not with garlands, but with the charred timbers of subdued villages. For 2 long months, William did not march directly on London. He was a strategist, not a berserker. He understood that the decapitation of the English state was not complete, that the spirit of resistance, though stunned, still flickered in the hearts of the surviving earls and the citizens of the great city. So, he embarked on a campaign of deliberate, terrifying demonstration. He moved his army in a wide, crushing arc around London, a scythe sweeping through the home counties. Dover was taken and its garrison fortified, Canterbury submitted. His forces crossed the Thames at Wallingford, a move that cut the capital off from potential reinforcements in the north and west. It was a strategy of psychological warfare, as calculated as the feigned retreat at Hastings. He was showing the English, not just telling them, that their land was now his to traverse, their strongholds his to occupy, their will his to break. He allowed them to feel the full, helpless weight of his presence, to let the reality of their new situation sink in. Their king was dead, his army was ashes, and no divine intervention was coming to save them from the conqueror. The message was received. As William's shadow fell over Berkhamsted in December, a delegation of English nobles, including Edgar the Etheling, the last prince of the ancient royal bloodline, and the Archbishop of York, emerged from London. They came not in defiance, but in submission. Their spirit was broken. They offered him the crown. The coronation was set for Christmas Day, 1066, in the newly completed Westminster Abbey, the very church consecrated by the saintly Edward less than a year before. The symbolism was potent and deliberate. William was not just seizing power, he was positioning himself as the legitimate successor, the heir to the Confessor's legacy, the man chosen by God to cleanse the kingdom of an oathbreaker and restore order. The atmosphere in London that morning was thick with a tension that no amount of festive decoration could disguise. The city was an armed camp. Norman men-at-arms, their faces hard and watchful, lined the streets and packed the precincts of the abbey, their alien chainmail and nasal helmets a stark contrast to the familiar sights of the English capital. Inside the great church, a fragile attempt at unity was staged. The Norman bishops and nobles stood alongside their English counterparts, their robes a splash of color against the cold, new stone. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the slow, resonant chant of the liturgy. William, having processed through the sullen, silent streets, stood before the high altar, a massive, imposing figure in his ducal robes. The service, conducted by the Archbishop of York, was a dual-language affair, the sacred words spoken in both Latin and English, a careful piece of political theater meant to bridge the chasm between conqueror and conquered. As the crucial moment arrived, the traditional question was put to the congregation, first in English by the Archbishop, and then in French by a Norman bishop: did they accept this man as their king? A roar of acclamation, a mingled shout of "yeah" and "we" from the assembled nobles of both nations, filled the vast space of the abbey, bouncing off the high, vaulted ceiling. It was the sound of legitimacy, of a new order being born in a sacred space. But outside the abbey's thick stone walls, the Norman guard stationed in the churchyard and the surrounding streets heard a very different sound. To their ears, conditioned by months of warfare, suspicion, and the constant fear of ambush, the muffled, thunderous roar from within the church was not one of acclamation. It was a sudden, explosive outburst of noise from a confined space filled with Englishmen. In their hypervigilant state, their minds, shaped by the trauma of Hastings and the subsequent campaign of terror, leapt to the only logical conclusion: their duke, their leader, was being betrayed and butchered inside the church. It was a trap. The English had lured them all into a sacred space for a final, bloody massacre. Without waiting for orders, driven by a visceral mix of loyalty and panic, they acted. They drew their swords. They lit the torches they held for the winter ceremony. And they began to burn. It was not a strategic decision, it was a primal, terrified response. The thatched roofs and wooden outbuildings that crowded around the great stone abbey were instantly ablaze. The flames, hungry and swift, licked up the sides of nearby houses, the fire spreading with a terrifying crackle that soon drowned out the chanting from within. The smoke, thick and black and acrid, began to drift into the abbey itself, stinging the eyes of the congregation and casting a hellish, flickering glow through the high windows. Inside, the solemn ritual reached its zenith just as the chaos outside erupted. The crown of England, a heavy, jeweled circlet, was lifted and placed upon William's head. At the precise moment he became a king, the world outside seemed to scream in protest. The unified roar of acclamation was shattered by new, discordant sounds that pierced the stone walls, the screams of Londoners, the clash of steel, the panicked shouts of treachery, in Norman French, and the ever-growing, horrifying roar of the fire. The congregation, Norman and English alike, froze in confusion and terror. The English, seeing the smoke and hearing the violence, believed the Normans had begun a premeditated slaughter, a sacrilegious massacre on Christmas Day. The Normans inside, hearing the same, believed their comrades outside were being attacked and were fighting for their lives. The fragile pageant of unity dissolved into a panicked stampede. Nobles scrambled for the doors, trampling each other in their fear, their fine robes tearing. The sacred vessels on the altar rattled as men shoved past them. The air, once filled with prayer, was now thick with smoke and screams. Through it all, William remained at the altar. He did not flinch. He did not run. He stood, a solitary, terrifying figure, as his coronation collapsed into anarchy around him. He could feel the weight of the crown, cold and heavy, upon his brow. He could see the terror in the eyes of the English bishops, smell the smoke of the burning city that was now his, and hear the sounds of the people he now ruled being killed by the soldiers he had brought. This was not the triumphant, serene ascension he had envisioned. This was a violent seizure, a coronation baptized not in holy oil, but in fire and fear. His shoulders, already broad, seemed to bow for a moment under the immense, terrible weight of it all. This was the true face of his kingship. He was not being welcomed as a liberator or a rightful heir, he was a conqueror, and his reign was being born in the same violence that had won him his crown. The fire, the panic, the terror, this was the foundational truth of his rule, a prophecy written in flame against the London sky. The last of the congregation fled the smoky, chaotic church, leaving William alone with his new, dreadful title and the crackling fury of the world outside. He was the King of England, but the first act of his reign was the sound of his own men setting his capital ablaze. The bastard of Normandy had won his crown, but he would forever rule a kingdom whose submission was etched in terror and whose loyalty was written in ash.